Once again, it's so good to see everybody here this morning. If you will, turn to Mark chapter 4. We're going to pick up our study in the Gospel of Mark there. And we'll be in Mark chapter 4 and verse 35. Now, what we've been doing here in our study in the Gospel of Mark is trying to peek behind the scenes. As we mentioned in the introduction to Mark, traditionally it's believed that Mark actually wrote down these stories as he listened to Peter preach. And as he did that, he would have, what we could kind of think about as we think about him writing these things down is, what was Peter preaching about when Mark wrote these things down? And whether we can really get to that point to where we know, this is what Peter is preaching about, or not, we can at least go back and see as we go through the Gospel of Mark, these themes that kind of run through it. Almost like thread that kind of just runs through and ties things together, one thing after the other. Mark is a very concise story of Jesus' life. And so what's important is not only what's included, but what was left out. And as we look at that book, we begin to see, Peter, of course, who was with Christ for 3.5 years, saw a multitude of things, miracles and teachings and things like that. And what we have in the Gospel of Mark is selective events and teachings from Christ. We saw last week that Christ had gave some teachings about the gospel or about the kingdom that would have related to the apostles and what they were about to do. In chapter 3, we had how Jesus had demonstrated how they would have different reactions as they went across the world preaching the gospel. Sometimes they would be popular, sometimes they would be despised, sometimes they would be misunderstood, and that was very important. But in chapter 4, we saw that even the word that they were proclaiming was going to have different reactions on different people, such as with the parable of the sower. And it would even have meager beginnings, but eventually it would expand and grow into something great. As we get to the end of chapter 4, we find 4 miracles that teach also a lesson. And there seems to be a thread that runs through these 4 miracles. At the end of the Gospel of John, John said that if all the things that Christ had done while he was here on the earth were written down, the world could not contain the books. That's how much he did. But Mark seems to specifically bring out these 4 miracles. And when you look at these 4 miracles, which is the stealing of the storm, the casting out of the demons and the demonic, we see Jairus' daughter raised back to life, the woman with the flow of blood, all these are situations where it seemed impossible. These were impossible cases. Things in which people had no solution. There was nothing they could do. And we'll see that more as we look at the details of each of these miracles. But these are situations where, you would just basically throw up your hands and say, it's impossible. There's nothing we can do about this situation. But Jesus steps in, and he's the solution to the problem time and time again. And so we'll kind of follow that theme as we go through these 4 miracles. But this would have been very important to the apostles because it would have shown them, hey, there's going to be some times when you're going into all the world to preach the gospel and you're going to come across some situations that seem impossible. And you need to have the faith to realize that you follow a Messiah, a leader who can bring you through those impossible situations. That will really be brought out in the first miracle we look at. But all 4 of these would have impressed that. But even on us, just Jesus' disciples in general, we can look at these stories and really build up our faith. Because oftentimes we come to situations in life where we just say, we don't know what we're going to do about this. And we have no solutions, we have no plan, and we just run up against a wall. But where are we going to place our faith? Well, these stories teach us we place our faith in Jesus Christ. He's the solution. That's easy math. In math, when you're doing problems, there's different solutions based on how you do the mathematics. I was horrible in math when I was a kid, especially fractions. couldn't always come up with a solution. But when it comes to life, there's just one solution: Jesus Christ. Easy math. You got a problem? The solution is Jesus. Now the details might be worked out different, but the ultimate solution, the ultimate answer is Jesus. And we'll find that as we go through here. So first let's look at this calming of the storm, or this gale of wind as it's called here in Mark chapter 4. It starts again in chapter 4 verse 35. It says, "On that day, when evening came, he said to them, 'Let us go over to the other side.'" Now the same day as when he taught these parables. Jesus had a long day, teaching all day long. We just have 3 parables in Mark, but we find in Matthew several more parables, and there might have been even more than that. But he basically had been standing in a boat, or actually sitting in a boat all day long, just teaching. And so it's getting to the end of the day. He says, "Hey, let us go to the other side." And that echoes, or will later echo, his statement where he says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Let us go into all the world is basically another way you could say it, because Christ was going to be with them. And as we go through this story, it's very important that we not only see what it meant historically at the time when these events took place, but also to see what these things bring out symbolically, and could have the impressions that could have been made on the apostles' heart as they experienced these things in real time. And when you go into the scriptures, you find that the sea represents the world. We saw that in Matthew chapter 13, that very last parable, the parable of the dragnet, where they cast the net into the sea, and the sea represented the world. And the idea was that the gospel was going to be spread out into all the world, and then it was going to bring in all different types of people. As in the parable, it brought in all different types of fish. And then at the end, then it'd be decided which was the good fish and which was the bad fish. And so the sea represented the world. And if we follow that symbolism as we go through this story, I think we get some very good teachings from it. And I think the apostles would have gotten some pretty good lessons as well. So it says, "Let us go out into the other side." Notice he doesn't say, "Let us try to get to the other side." Let's make an attempt to get on the other side. That's very important as we continue in this story. So keep that in your mental Rolodex. He's saying, let us go to the other side. In other words, it's going to happen. Let's go. In verse 36, leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. So in other words, they took him as he was. He's already in the boat. He's been teaching. But they didn't go back to the shore, get extra supplies. They didn't have time to prepare. And with this storm that was about to take place, have all the necessary tools and things that they would need. They're probably, who knows, in a smaller boat, because Jesus just needed a boat to teach out of. So this is very significant too. There's no preparation here. They just take off, even as they are. Even if they tried to go on the shore, the crowd was so dense, there was no way they'd been able to really get anything done anyway. So they just take off as they are. It says in verse 37, "And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up." So this would have been, or seemed like, a very impossible situation. Out in the middle of a sea, in the middle of a storm, what are you to do? And this is very common in the Sea of Galilee. So what would happen is the cool air coming from the Mediterranean in the west would come over the mountain ridge, and then it would kind of swoop down where the warm air that was coming off of the Sea of Galilee. And this cold air meeting the warm air, whenever that occurred, fierce storms would take place. It'd become very tumultuous, and it would happen out of nowhere. You could be fishing, it'd be sunshine like it is right now. By the afternoon, you're fighting a storm and your life's threatened. That's kind of what happens here with them. So they're not prepared for it. It happens out of nowhere. It's just difficulty. It seems like the solution is not there. It seems like an impossible situation. Now they would encounter this as they went into the world to preach the gospel. They would encounter winds and waves. What do we mean by that? Winds and waves. Well, there was times when that literally happened. Remember when Paul was being transported over to Rome, and they had that big storm. He ends up on the island, gets snake bitten and all that stuff. He literally was in a storm, but symbolically, they also would enter into these types of storms. The wind can be symbolized, or can symbolize, demonic forces or spiritual forces, invisible forces that work against us and would have worked against them. In Ephesians chapter 2, the devil is called the prince of the power of the air. Very, very different way of describing him, right? The prince of the power of the air. If you think about air, it's pretty much invisible. You can't see air. You can see the effects of air. When the wind blows, you can see the tree, the leaves move. You can feel it against your skin, but you can't see air. And I believe what's being captured by Paul there in Ephesians chapter 2 is the idea that he's the prince of the power of the invisible forces that work against us. Because just a few chapters over, he would say that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, chapter 6, but against the world forces of this darkness, the spiritual forces in the heavenly places. In other words, the things you can't see. So we talked about this before. You having that problem at work, or you having family problems, or any other type of problems you're having in life, you're not really wrestling against flesh and blood. You're wrestling against the prince of the power of the air that comes blowing in sometimes, even sometimes as a gale, a very fierce wind that blows into your life. And what does that do? It stirs up the waters. We talked about the sea, symbolic of the world. So these spiritual forces come blowing into the world and just stir things up for us and cause big waves and trials and difficulties and hardships, and we can't seem to know where we're going, and there's just chaos everywhere. I think God keeps these forces at bay, but for specific reasons, he lets them loose. Whether to teach us a lesson, to give us strength, to build up our faith, or maybe even to discipline us. There's times in which God says, okay, have at it, like he did with Job. Remember when Satan wanted to get to Job? But he just opens the gates, and the evil forces, these world invisible forces that come in and stir up the things in our lives, come against us. And it becomes so severe that this description of what was happening with them on the boat happens to us as well. It comes crashing against the boat, and the boat was filling up, just becoming submerged, overcome by the waters. And I think any of us here who have lived long enough know of situations in life where you were just overwhelmed. It's like, it's not just that I'm dealing with things exterior to me, but these things are washing against me so much that they're even affecting me on the inside. Maybe causing anxiety, fear, depression. It just swallows you up, even to the point of despair. And you feel like there's no way out. It's too difficult. That's what Satan wants to do. He wants to make us feel overwhelmed. He wants to take away our hope. He wants to dissolve our faith through stirring up these circumstances. This is what was happening with the disciples, but it gets worse than that. In verse 38, look what they find Jesus doing. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up. We'll get to that in a minute, but he was asleep on the cushion. The time they needed Jesus the most, the time when the gale, fierce wind was blowing against them and these waves were overtaking the boat, you would expect Jesus to be up there with them, helping them at least with the sails, or helping them weight the cargo and stuff to make it a little bit easier to manage the boat. But Jesus is asleep. Remember, he's had a hard day. He's been teaching all day. But as we picture him there in the stern of the boat, he's just asleep, at peace. The Prince of Peace, at peace, in the midst of the storm. Remember what he said in John chapter 16? In the world you'll have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. Mix that with 1 John chapter 5, and where he says, by this we have overcome the world through our faith. Our faith overcomes the world. So you mix the Prince of Peace, who has overcome the world. You take our faith, which has already overcome the world, and you can be at rest. What should the disciples done in this situation? They should have went down in the stern and said, Master, move over. We want to rest with you. We want to lay down beside you in peace. That's what they should have done. Remember, Jesus said, let us go to the other side. He didn't say, let us try to get to the other side. Let's make an attempt to get to the other side. He said, let's go to the other side. And if Jesus says we're going to the other side, we're going to make it to the other side, whether there's a storm, whether there's an earthquake, whether the whole earth melts, we're going to make it to the other side. And we can be at rest in knowing we're going to get there. And that's what the disciples should have taken courage in. They should have laid down next to Jesus. Sometimes in our situations, when the gale of force wind, the gale of wind and mighty force comes against us, our lives are stirred up. Are there times, perhaps, where you can remember you prayed to the Lord and it seemed like the Lord was asleep? There was just silence on the other end of the line. That can be another challenge to faith. Sure, I prayed for it today. Okay, so he didn't answer it today. I prayed about it tomorrow. He didn't answer today, or he didn't answer then either. A week passed by, a month passed by. Is Jesus asleep? Does he even care that I'm perishing, that I'm overwhelmed, that these things are too difficult for me to handle? And all the while, he's just inviting us to rest with him, lay down in the boat with him, in the stern of the ship. But we get stirred up, and we get dismayed, because Jesus isn't acting the way that we think he should act. He's not doing what we think he should do. So it says, again, verse 38, Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And that's one of the first questions we ask when we go to prayer to the Lord and we don't get an immediate answer. Does he even care? Surely, we know he knows what we're going through. He's omnipresent. He's omniscient. That means he's all-seeing, he's all-knowing, he's all-present, he's all-knowing. He knows what we're going through. Does he just not care? Why isn't he up here on the top of the boat helping me with these problems? Well, he could help us if we would just trust in him and lay down in the boat with him. That would be the best help he could offer. It says in verse 39, And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, be still. And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. Showing that Jesus was in control the whole time. Whether the storm would have continued on, let's say they would have gotten down in the stern of the ship and rested with him, as they probably should have. Yeah, the storm might have lasted a bit longer, but they still would have made it to the other side. Why? Because Jesus was there. He was still in control. Whether he was asleep, awake, in the stern, or on the top of the boat, he was still in control. And this was just a minor thing. Jesus speaks to the storm like a father would speak to a child. Hush, be still. What happened? The storm just calmed. It obeyed him. Remember, John chapter 1. It says, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he says, everything that was made through him. And there wasn't anything that was made which wasn't made through him. In other words, he's created it all. Jesus was the means by which God created all things on the earth. So what is a bunch of water and a bunch of wind to him? It's nothing. He created it. He's in control of it. He's in the power over it all. And the same thing is true with the situations in our life. He remains in control. Even when he's not acting, he's in control. And we can trust in that. Even if the storm carries on for several days or several weeks, several months, or even several years, he's still in control. Maybe there's times where he will arise, rebuke the storm, speak into our circumstance, and all become calm. And we praise him and we worship him when that occurs. But just because he doesn't do that doesn't mean he's not still in control. That's very important to understand. And he said to them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? So here was a challenge to their faith. Do you not have any faith? We might think, well, didn't they have faith? They went down to Jesus and asked him, they went to him wondering what was going on. But because they didn't trust that Jesus is in the boat, everything's going to be okay. He said we're going to the other side, so we're going to the other side. He questioned their faith. So this was a challenge for them, for their faith. And this there's actually two storms in the Gospel of Mark. And when you compare those side by side, it's kind of interesting. Both the similarities and the differences. In this particular case, Jesus is with them in the boat. Later on, when they're in another storm, Jesus is not with them in the boat. He actually stays on the mountain. After feeding the multitudes, he sends them out and he goes up on a mountain. So they're out on the sea by themselves, and another storm comes. And then that's when he comes walking on the water and saves them there. This was the first step to them learning about faith. Have faith when Jesus is in the boat. Jesus, at that point, was with them physically as they were going out and traveling all through Galilee, as they even would go down into Judea and minister there, doing all these different things. Jesus was in the boat with them. They could trust him. They could lean on him. He was a great resource for them to accomplish what he was calling them to do. But one day, they were going to be sent out without Jesus in the boat, so to speak. He was going to ascend back to the Father, sit at the right hand of the Father, but he would still be present with them and still would be a guide to them. So this is their first step. And if you can't believe, if you can't have faith in him while he's in the boat, what are you going to do when he's not in the boat? Is kind of the idea. And he's again moving them through this process of faith. And I believe in our lives, God does the same thing for us. He meets us where we are. And he's always trying to take us to the next step of faith, from faith to faith. He's trying to move us in that direction. Little by little, more and more each day, we should be growing in faith, growing in trust in him. It starts with the little challenges. It starts with the little things here and there, but it progresses until we have absolute trust and faith in him, which is where he's trying to lead us. He did it with the disciples, with the apostles, and he'll do it with us as well. In verse 41, they became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Can you just imagine? I mean, we take this story for granted, but we have people who can't even predict the weather. You get on weather apps and, you know, they get up there and they try to tell you what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, and it's nothing like what they said. They can't even predict it, at least not 100% of the time. And here's a man who controls it himself. I'm not going to tell you what it's going to do. I'm going to make it do what it's going to do. That's what they witnessed right there on that boat. It was amazing. And, of course, they were afraid. I wonder what the conversations with Jesus was like after this. You know, how do you talk to a guy after you've already seen him do this? I don't know. I don't even know if I could carry on a conversation. I'm just, you know. But anyways, so this is what he shows them. This is the first impossible situation that they come across as recorded in the Gospel of Mark. Storms are going to come. Fierce storms. Waves might even threaten to overwhelm you. But Jesus is the ruler, the master of the sea. And he is always in control. In inactivity and in activity, he's always in control. And you can trust him. Now we get into chapter 5. So we've seen impossible situations when it seemed like when they were going to perish. But now we're going to see an impossible situation when it comes to reformation. Although I don't think that's a strong enough word, probably more restoration. We're going to find another impossible case, and this time it has to do with an individual, not nature, but a specific individual. It says in chapter 5 and verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. Okay, so this was a place that was about 35 miles southeast of the Sea of Galilee. Now, it's most likely they didn't travel that far. There's also a little village that's still there today that was bedded up against the coast of the Sea of Galilee, which is more likely where he showed up. So this area of the Gerasenes could be a broad area, not the specific place that they're tied to. So there's a little village even there today that's right there on the coast, and there's even a slope. That becomes significant as we go through the story. You can go there today, still see this slope. I think they say it's about 40 yards wide. And it slopes down, or actually I think it's like 40 yards from the sea. And it slopes down kind of towards the sea. And then about a mile from that, there's these caves and these places where they bury people, cemetery. And back then it was very common for poor people to live in these caves. So these caves would have been very good for getting out of the elements and staying dry when it was raining and stuff, but they also used them for burying people as well. And this is the area that they went to as they crossed over the sea and got to the other side. And it was also a place that was primarily Gentile. And you don't even have to know anything about history or anything to know that, because as we get through the story, we're going to find that they were raising swine or pigs. And the Jews wouldn't do that. That was an unclean animal. So they wouldn't do that at all. So we can tell that this was probably a Gentile area, showing that Jesus' power would reach even to Gentiles, even though at this point his main focus was on the Jewish people there in Galilee. But nonetheless, this is where he is. In verse 2 it says, when he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And as he was dwelling among the tombs, and he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gashing himself with stones. And so this man was an impossible situation. People tried to control him. They tried chains, they tried shackles, they tried whatever they could to contain him, but it was just impossible. This man was overcome by many, many demons. A legion of demons were inhabiting this guy, and there was nothing anyone could do to control him. Just an impossible situation. Now, as we think about this, again, we want to look at this in two ways. Historically, this was a historical event, but also symbolically as well. We find that in life we come across impossible people, or maybe we ourselves sometimes are impossible people. That is, people who are just uncontrollable. And I think all of us are that way to a certain degree, some more obvious than others. But it seems as though the more you try to shackle them down, chain them to something, the more and more they resist, the more and more they rebel. And their dwelling is among the dead. Sin brings about death, and they're in a state of rebellion and sin, and they're living in a state of spiritual death. And you look at their situation, they're uncontrollable. They're living a life of just sin and rebellion and debauchery and death, spiritual death. And you look at them and say, that's just an impossible case. One thing we can do is reflect on ourselves. All of us have a little bit of that. People try to put a chain on us and we want to break it loose. All of us have a spark of rebellion in us to some degree. And all of us spend our time sometimes dwelling among the dead, getting involved in situations and scenarios we have no business in sometimes. Or if we don't now, at some point in our life, perhaps we did. And so when we look at that situation, we might think, is it possible for such a person to be transformed? And as psychologists or whoever might say, politician might say reform. But again, I like the idea of transformation better. To transform that particular situation into something else. Well, in verse 6, seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. And shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me." So get this. People have been trying to shackle him. They chained him, tried to control this guy that was out of control. And that same person, when he contacts Jesus, down to the ground, bows down before him. That shows the authority, the power of Christ, even over people who seem impossible, even over evil spirits. Again, we get this idea of evil spirits being behind what's going on outwardly with this man. But when he contacts Christ, he goes down. The sea and the wind are hushed and stilled. This demonic, uncontrollable, bows down. Just showing the authority of Christ here. And he says, what business do we have with one another, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In other words, I'm of one kingdom, you're of another kingdom. Let me to my business, you get to your business, Jesus, and let's not let neither of the twain meet. I got my business, you do your business. What business do we have with each other, Son of the Most High God? And he says, do not torment me. Jesus and the demonic here recognize the fact, or the demons at least within the demonic, recognize that Jesus could get to the source of the problem. Everybody on the outside could only try to control the person physically. But these demons recognize that Jesus himself could touch them personally and torment them. What human can do that? Only Jesus could do that. He could reach in at the source and torment these demons that have been tormenting this demonic. Verse 8, for he had been saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And he was asking him, what is your name? And he said to him, my name is Legion, for we are many. So a legion in Roman times was 6,000 soldiers. So whether this is a literal, that's exactly how many were in this demonic, but doesn't matter, just the fact that he had so many that name would be assigned to him, or they would assign that name to themselves, is significant. In verse 10, and he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there were a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, send us into the swine, so that we may enter them. So these demons would prefer to dwell in a pig than to try to stand before the Son of God and to face the ramifications of trying to act out against the Son of God. Put me in a pig, please. Put me anywhere. Don't send me out of the country. Don't cast me into the abyss. Put me in a pig, is what they're asking. It says, verse 12, already read that. Verse 13, Jesus gave them permission and come. That's important as well, right? He gave them permission. Again, contrast this to where he was before. Humans couldn't bind him, couldn't control him, couldn't throw the rule book at him, couldn't do anything to him. Jesus gives them permission. They have to ask Jesus permission to do anything, these powerful demons. Anyways, it says, in coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them. And they were drowned in the sea. Okay, there it is, 2,000. And they were drowned into the sea. So here they go into swine, ultimate destruction as they go down into the sea, which is a picture of what will happen in the end. When Satan is taken and cast into the abyss, or actually cast into the lake of fire. Here's the lake of the Sea of Galilee, in a sense a lake, but in the end he's going to be thrown into the lake of fire. Him and all his cohorts and whatnot, they're going to be thrown into the lake of fire. So we're getting a little picture of what's going to happen. So as we think about, what we have to face in life, and we think about the fact, we read Ephesians chapter 6 and we see, we're not up against flesh and blood, but all these spiritual forces of darkness and the heavenly places and the world forces and all these things going on. We might think, that seems like an impossible task. I'm just one person. But again, Jesus one day will have control. Even now he has control. They have to ask permission of him to do anything. But ultimately he's going to demonstrate that authority and rule when evil is cast away and done away with permanently. Now it has kind of a role to play in strengthening us, challenging us, helping us to become more devoted to him, more faithful. But one day he's going to say it's enough. And they're going to be drowned into the sea or cast into the lake of fire. Verse 14, their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed. Now listen to this. Sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion. And they became frightened. None of these people saw Jesus cast out the demons. Some of them reported it, but the ones that heard the report, they didn't actually see this miracle. But how did they know that something significant had happened? They saw the man clothed, sitting down, and in his right mind. Something they thought would never happen. Something they thought was impossible. There's no way this guy can be controlled. We tried it. But this man became controlled, in his right mind, fully transformed because Christ touched his life and met him or dealt with the very source of his problem, something that the other people could not do. And that is a testimony that we have among the world. When people see us transformed, why doesn't Joey do what he used to do? Why don't I see so-and-so going about what they used to do? Or, wow, that person is a totally different person. When I talk to them, it's not even like I'm talking to the same person. Well, we can point them to Jesus. Like, Jesus is the one who brings transformation. He's the one that can eradicate our past and move us into a new life, into a new situation with new desires, new motivations, a new heart. He's the one that brings ultimate transformation, even in impossible, what we think is impossible people. So, I'm going to get on my soapbox for a little bit, so that means that when you're looking around in your life, you see that coworker, you see that family member, you see the neighbor, maybe you see a person on TV, whatever it is, and you see somebody, be a little bit more careful before you ride them off. And say, I'm not going to really talk about Jesus to them because, look at them. They're not going to ever respond to the gospel. They're not ever going to listen to what I have to say. They're too far gone. It's an impossible situation. A person like that can't be reformed or transformed or anything like that. Let's focus on other people. Just be very careful before we do that. Now, Jesus did say, don't cast your pearls before swine. There might come a point when you do share the gospel with people that you realize this person is closed off to it. I need to back off for a little bit because I need to divert my attention somewhere else because this person has already refused it. What I'm talking about is not even sharing the gospel with them at all, not even talking to them about Jesus, because you already wrote them off as being an impossible situation. Please don't ever do that. I know in my experience, the hardest people to share the gospel with and for them to receive it are the people who are already quote unquote good. The people who take care of their house, who pay their bills, they obey the law, they seem to think, hey, I'm good enough, I can make it to heaven. And oftentimes it's hard for them to see their need for Jesus because they think, hey, I'm an okay guy or I'm an okay girl, I'm all right, I'm good to go. But usually the people who are dwelling among the tombs, so to speak, those who have been rebellious, who've seen the ugly side of sin, who've seen how sin has just devastated and ransacked their lives, those are the people who are looking for something else. Those are the people who are desperate. Those are the people who are really hungering and thirsting for something beyond what they've seen up to this point in their lives. And oftentimes, they're the ones who are going to be mostly responsive to the gospel. Now, it's hard to speak in absolutes. Obviously, there's people who are converted on both sides, but just never push to the side those who you think are impossible. Think of this demonic. Think of the fact that he was sitting down and clothed and in his right mind, something everyone thought would be impossible. Verse 16, those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. So we don't really know exactly why they wanted him to leave the region. They might have been a people that were highly superstitious. And when they hear about this Jesus coming in, it got them so afraid. And that seems to be in the text that fear kept them wanting to, moved them to want to get him out of there. But some have also suggested maybe because he was affecting them financially. Oh, their whole herd of swine have been gone into the sea. If this guy hangs around too much longer, we're not going to have anything to sell. We're just going to go bankrupt. And so they're wanting to go away for that reason. But for whatever reason, they became afraid of losing their financial stability or afraid of what this man was doing as far as in the spiritual realm. Either way, they became frightened and they just wanted him to leave. And that will be the response of some. Some will see the transformation power of Christ and be encouraged and motivated to follow in suit and to follow Christ. Others will see it and be turned away. They'll see that person who is transformed, but see what it costs them, maybe, and then become afraid and say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with Jesus. Have him leave the region, so to speak. Then in verse 19, and he did not let him, but he said to him, I skipped a few verses. In verse 18, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. So the demon-possessed man wants to go along with Jesus, and rightfully so. If you've experienced what this guy had experienced, you'd want to follow Jesus as well. But in verse 19, and he did not let him, but he said to him, go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. Sometimes that's even better, in the sense that oftentimes maybe we go through a transformation process and then we just want to stay huddled up with people who have also been transformed. We want to huddle up with just this particular group, when maybe the best thing we can do, not that we ever totally leave that group, but the fact that what can be most helpful is just to go out and tell our story. Go out and give our testimony of what the Lord has done for us. Sometimes the Lord told people to be quiet. Sometimes he told them to go out. This is one case where he told them to go out. And I suspect this is probably because of the region that he was in. In Galilee, primarily Jewish, although it did have a mixture of Gentiles as well, Jesus was keeping people quiet. In this region where he wouldn't be at quite as much, go out and tell it. Let your voice be what draws people to me. And go out into that area and proclaim what the Lord has done for you. We need wisdom to know when to speak, when to be silent. But the idea is just that we give our testimony. Let people see the good things that the Lord has done for us. In verse 20, and he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. The Decapolis was the region of 10 cities. And these were Gentile cities. You can do it by breaking down the word Deca, Polis, 10 cities. Anyways, these were places that were primarily Gentile. Remember, Jesus' primary goal was to go to the Jews, but that didn't mean that he wasn't going to allow some of the Gentiles to hear about the wonderful things that he had been doing. And so this is what this man's job was. So here, you have a man who was screaming out among the tombs. Now he's screaming out among the 10 cities. This is what Jesus has done for me. This is how he changed my life. We need that in our lives as well. Let's go out and proclaim the wonderful things that Christ has done. So those are two miracles. That's where we'll end this morning. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the next two miracles that basically give us, again, some impossible scenarios, situations that seem impossible. And hopefully we can continue this thought of recognizing just because it looks impossible, just because it feels impossible, all things are possible to him who believes. All things are possible for God. It's our faith that overcomes the world. Our faith in a Christ who has already overcome the world. So don't give up. Don't walk away. Don't say it's too hard. Don't throw your Bible down on the coffee table and walk away. Don't walk away from Christ. Stay true to him. What seems impossible tomorrow will be the very source of your praise tomorrow. That's it. What seems impossible today will be the source of your praise tomorrow. And will be the one thing that causes you to just praise the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So if you're here today and you want to give your life to Christ, maybe you've seen how impossible life can be without him. And now you want to turn to the Savior who opens up a world of possibilities for your life, for transformation, and many other different areas of your life. If you want to give your life to Christ, please come forward now as we stand and sing the song that JT has prepared.